During a late-night press conference with journalists gathered at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Russian President Putin once again demonstrated that he remains steadfast in his positions when it comes to ending the Russian-Ukrainian war. Putin says that he wants this war to end as soon as possible and, in his own words, does not rule out the possibility of ending it peacefully. However, it is clear that all these statements are primarily aimed at the American President Donald Trump. After all, Putin is quick to agree that if Trump were president of the United States, this war would not have happened. Why? He does not explain. He continues to insist that the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine had the right to secede from Ukraine according to the UN Charter or based on the Kosovo precedent. Although we perfectly understand that neither the UN Charter allows one state to annex the territories of another, nor does the Kosovo precedent in any way correspond to what happened with the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine occupied by the Russian army. Nevertheless, Putin is now talking about the legitimacy of the sovereignty of two more Ukrainian regions occupied by Russian troops. Of course, he means Zaporizhia and Kherson regions based on the same kind of referendum. However, the Russian president continues to not rule out not only the possibility of negotiations between Moscow and Kyiv, but also his own meeting with the president of Ukraine at the final stage in order to put an end to it. At the same time, Putin continues to insist on the illegitimacy of Zelensky's government, referring to the constitution of Ukraine, and emphasizes that for Russia it remains important who will sign any agreements that may be reached between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. At the same time, the Russian president continues to insist that the source of power for those currently governing Ukraine is the so-called 2014 coup d'etat, when, as is known, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine had to remove then President Viktor Yanukovych from office after he left Ukrainian territory and ended up in the Russian Federation. Now the question naturally arises, what significance does the term of office of Volodymyr Zelensky have for Putin in this specific context, if, after all, he does not recognize the legitimacy of any authority formed in Ukraine after 2014, and how, in general, can Ukraine return to any kind of legitimacy if, from Putin's point of view, the transfer of power after 2014 is a sign of a coup d'etat that Moscow cannot accept? And why, by the way, at that same press conference, does Putin refer to the Iranian government as legitimate and refuses to even discuss the possibility of eliminating Ayatollah Khamenei? After all, the source of power for this Ayatollah, as well as for all other Iranian institutions, is the coup d'etat in 1979, when protesters overthrew the legitimate government of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, government recognized by the entire international community, including the then Soviet Union. And from this Putin's point of view, Prince Reza Pahlavi, who now leads the Iranian opposition, has far greater legitimacy than all the Ayatollahs combined. But we both know perfectly well that Putin is absolutely uninterested in the legitimacy of any country's leadership. For him, countries are divided into those who help him in his fight against the West and those who are his enemies or must be eliminated, like Ukraine and annexed to the Russian Federation. After all, the annexation of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine, as well as Crimea, is only the first step in Putin's aggressive plans. And of course, even at this press conference, Putin had to respond to questions about Moscow's recent crimes involving the bombing of residential neighborhoods in Kyiv. As we can see here too, the Russian president remains absolutely true to himself. Putin claims that there was no bombing of residential neighborhoods and that Russian aviation was targeting military factories. When the journalist pointed out that his colleagues who had been in Kyiv had witnessed the destruction of residential neighborhoods, Putin simply replied that if that had really been the case, they would not have survived. And if they were simply able to observe the situation from the sidelines, then according to him, there were no crimes committed by Russians against civilians in Kyiv or other Ukrainian cities. And this once again shows that Russia continues to commit its crimes against residents of peaceful neighborhoods in Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities in a completely systematic and deliberate manner, and at the personal will of Russian President Putin, who openly mocks those who remind him of the crimes connected to Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians. Thus, it can be stated that Putin will continue to adhere to his tactic of dragging out time through a simulated negotiation process with the intention of continuing terror against the peaceful Ukrainian population and occupying new Ukrainian territories. This is the Russian president's plan for the presidency of Donald Trump. And now it depends on his American counterpart whether Donald Trump is ready to continue, as we have observed in recent months, to follow this political plan of Putin without even attempting to oppose the cruel and deceitful Russian president. Or will he return to a policy that will force the Russian president to abandon further military actions on the territory of Ukraine and at the very least agree to a comprehensive ceasefire, which Trump proposed to Putin immediately after being elected president of the United States, and in the advisability of which, as we can see, the American president failed to convince the Russian one. But Putin will continue to talk about his readiness for peace negotiations in order to give Trump the opportunity to block any new sanctions against the Russian Federation, if, of course, the American president still has the desire to act as a lobbyist for Russian interests in the White House. I don't know how much Trump actually needs this at all, or how quickly the American president will part with his illusion that by taking such actions toward the Putin dictatorship, he can really destroy the alliance between Russia and China. At this Putin press conference, it was absolutely clear that this alliance, in the mind of the Russian president himself, is already beginning to acquire not only economic rationale, but also civilizational roots. Putin, who, as we know, mastered the German language so well that he could speak from the German podium of the Bundestag of the Federal Republic, is now boasting to Chinese journalists that his granddaughter speaks Chinese perfectly and that his daughter began studying Chinese on her own initiative back when it was not yet clear that Russia would adopt a course of confrontation with the Western world. And this groveling of the Russian president before Chinese journalists, this attempt of his to prove that Russia is gradually becoming part of Chinese civilization, where is that so-called Russian world now, which has in fact already bowed before the Chinese one? This once again proves just how deep and serious China's influence on Russia is today, as Russia has by and large turned into a political proxy force for Beijing, and no Donald Trump can change this anymore, even if he openly works in the interests of the Russian political leadership. Because today, working in the interests of the Russian political leadership means working in the interests of the Chinese one. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, follow me on my social networks, and on my Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee and Donatella channels, which help support and develop these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Wishing you victory and peace. Good luck.